So I currently work for Google Chrome. I lead the writing team for Chrome DevRel. So if you've ever read anything on web.dev or developer.chrome.com that was published in the last 5 years, that was something to do with me or my brilliant team of writers who publish to those sites and help support DevRel and the wider Chrome org. And so today I'm going to talk a bit about browser support, because we've already mentioned that I've been doing this for a very, very long time, and a constant theme of my career, and I started with the version 2 browsers, so I actually predate CSS, but a constant theme is, does it work in, at the time, the other browser? Does it work in all browsers? Is this thing that I want to use, is it something that is going to actually function if someone in a browser other than the one I'm working in, they pull up the site? And this is something that hasn't ever really changed. We still talk about this all the time. And so I actually came to Google. I started working at Chrome to work on a project that became known as Baseline. I'm not going to talk too much about Baseline itself. I think a lot of people have heard about it, but I will do a short introduction just in case people haven't. But the whole idea about Baseline was to clarify the language around browser support for features, because we know that sort of this issue of one browser launching something first and others having to catch up, and it changes which browser that is first, but that's never going to go away, because you don't get a spec written and it suddenly appear in all browsers. That's just not practically going to happen. So there's always going to be this issue of some things not working in some browsers at some point. And we wanted to kind of find a good way to clarify that language to make that situation clear. And so that was really where the whole Baseline project came from. And so we defined this idea of things being baseline newly available. And that meant that it's supported in Chrome, both desktop and Android, Edge, Firefox desktop and Android, and Safari, macOS, and iOS. So the minute something hits all of those browsers, the latest release, we call it Baseline newly available. It's interoperable, and it works properly across all of those browsers. And then after 30 months, the feature becomes Baseline widely available. And why 30 months? Well, there was a lot of debate about why 30 months, and that debate happened not just from people at Chrome, by people from all of the browsers and people from the community. And we kind of worked out, looking at data, that after 30 months, you can pretty safely use a feature without worrying too much about support, unless you know something very specific about your audience. So you might know that you have a lot of people locked into older browsers, for example. And so you might want to make a different choice. But for most people, if you've got no other data widely available, is a good point that you can actually just use the feature. So as an example, container queries, something that we waited for a very, very long time on the web platform, it's now widely available. So if you're thinking, are container queries actually safe to use? It's probably a case that, yes, they are. You can probably use container queries quite safely in most applications. As I say, that's the sort of decision around that line was made as a large group with people from lots of browsers. So that Baseline widely available line is a pretty good line to track if you are if you don't have a lot of data. So you're doing a brand new site, you don't have existing data, generally that's going to work out well for you. Now, since we launched Baseline itself, the really cool thing has been the amount of tooling that has showed up to help you use it. So, for example, if you use VS Code or anything based on VS Code, you'll see the Baseline status when you hover over features. Chrome DevTools has support. Browsers List now supports Baseline, so you can use Baseline as part of that. ESLint supports Baseline. So we're seeing all these tools kind of converging on using this sort of terminology around browser support and creating that kind of clarity, which was really what we hoped for. So why widely available is a reasonable line to track. You might have information about your audience. You're building a new version of your site and you've got lots of data. So you might sort of decide that 30 months is too conservative. Actually, you could sort of push forward a bit. Or you might know that you've got a lot of people on older browsers and you want to be more cautious. So what a lot of people do in this situation is they adopt a baseline year. Because we know when things become newly available, we can kind of group them into years and say, well, if it became newly available in 2023, it's part of baseline 2023. And so that's obviously an option, is just to opt for a year. And we've got a really neat way of finding out which baseline year works for you if you happen to have Google Analytics on your site. So this is at chrome.dev Google Analytics baseline checker. You can go there. It used to be a lot harder. You had to create a very complicated report in Analytics and then upload the data. There's been some changes to Analytics recently that means that you can just connect your site on your own device. It will then use that data to show you how your traffic actually falls into those baseline years. It takes a couple of minutes, and you can see how baseline works for you. This is actually the data from web.dev. And you can kind of see that, baseline 2023, 98% of people have got all of those features. And then as you sort of come forward, fewer people, you start to get this drop off where some people haven't got the features. Newly available, well, that includes things that, say, just became newly available this month. There's obviously an awful lot fewer people have got support for everything because there's some very new things there that aren't going to be everywhere. So I think, if you want to have a look at that, that's a good way. It also helps you confirm whether widely available is a good line for you, because you can have a look and see how your audience stacks up against that widely available line. Generally, I would advise that use widely available if you can, because that line moves forward. So if you come back in 6 months' time, you're adding a feature to your site, you might find that a whole bunch of stuff is now available for you, which, that can be quite useful. You can then start to take advantage of new features. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to use the phrase your baseline. So take this to mean either the line you've adopted, maybe baseline 2023, or the widely available line that's moving forward. And we sort of refer to this as a baseline target. And so from that point, we can assume that you're confident that any feature included in your baseline can be used without worrying about browser support. Just use it. And you're either going to check the status of those things or use tooling to enforce that for you. So you're doing that, but then what about newer things? Does adopting baseline mean you should never, ever use anything else? You should only ever use the things that are in your baseline? And absolutely not. You should feel happy to use all of the things that the web platform is offering you. You should, be happy to go out there and look at those things and see if they work. And so you might think, well, how does it help me knowing what my baseline is if I'm still going to go and look for those things? But I think here's the thing. What baseline does is it gives you a better way to discuss those things and to define team norms around how you think about browser support. If nothing else, sort of landing on a baseline, it reduces the number of features that you actually need to make decisions about. If it's in your baseline, you don't need to worry about it. So the only features you need to worry about are those that are kind of outside of that, the ones that you need to make an individual decision about whether you're happy to use. So as you're sort of thinking about, doing your new site or adding some things to your site, within the group of things that aren't baseline, you're probably going to find a few things that you're like, oh, yeah, I'd really like us to be able to use that. There's a real benefit to us using that feature. So how do we think about those? Well, I think the first thing is what happens if someone doesn't have that feature. Features aren't equal in sort of the bad things that might happen if people don't have it. Some things are a very obvious progressive enhancement. The experience people without it get isn't terrible. If they have it, though, they get a little bit of a sort of improvement. There's some sort of very obvious examples for that. Something like text wrap pretty. Now, this is still classed as limited availability. It doesn't have support in Firefox. But it's a really nice little feature because it just stops you having the sort of, one word on a sentence if you've got, particularly with headings and things. It just balances your headings, makes that text look a bit nicer. Now, Nothing terrible happens to the reader who doesn't have text wrap pretty in their browser. They're not even going to notice any different, because you can't do this. There's no real way to do this without inserting line breaks at the moment. So if you've got it, your text looks nicer. If you don't have it, you're not actually going to notice, unless you're comparing two browsers, which nobody other than web designers actually does. So that's a feature that you might want to use. We also have the ability now to color our scroll bars. This is something we used to be able to do long in the past, with IE specific things, I think, and now it's come back. You can color your scroll bars if you want to. Again, it's probably not a terrible thing, and in fact, it might be a good thing if the scroll bar isn't colored for some users. But you can use that, if it adds to your application. In this example, the first color, so hot pink, is the thumb, so the bit that you scroll up and down, and the second color is the track, and you can have colored scroll bars. So then there are also things where you can do one thing if people have the feature, and you can do another if they don't. Because we've now got feature queries. They're very well supported. You can happily use those. They're widely available. So you can use feature queries to build an experience that works for people who don't have a certain feature, and then do something else if they do. CSS layout features often are quite a good example of where you can use this really well. They're very hard to polyfill, but you can often do something. For instance, subgrid has just become widely available, but if you've got a very conservative baseline target, you might want to do something else, perhaps a regular grid layout, and then use feature queries to check for subgrid support and then do your subgrid. So something like this. I think feature queries are just a really fantastic thing that we have in CSS now, to be able to essentially fork the experience and build on top of something a bit simpler to add in some new features. And so anything new that comes along, this is an opportunity you have. So this is the most frequently asked of questions. We introduce a new feature and immediately someone will say, is there a polyfill? Now, polyfills, which essentially is really using JavaScript to kind of recreate the functionality with JavaScript of a native feature, they can be a bit of a tricky subject, because whether or not it's possible to polyfill something really depends on the way the feature's been used and what else is happening in the site or application. It's very, very hard to create a polyfill that you can just drop in and say, this is fine to use in all circumstances. There's only a very few features that works for. And so there's a bit of baseline history here. When we were trying to work out what baseline should be, we investigated whether it was possible to have a version of baseline which was inclusive of polyfills. So kind of, you can safely use all these things as long as you also use the polyfill. And however, to include polyfills, they'd need to kind of meet a bar. And so we had this idea of sort of gold standard polyfills. And a gold standard polyfill would be something that implemented the entire specification. It shouldn't be a performance burden other than the small amount of having to load the JavaScript. You shouldn't be doing things like render blocking. It shouldn't create unintended layout shifts. Any of those things would mean that we couldn't really class it as gold standard. We couldn't suggest people used it. Example of that would be something like the URL pattern polyfill. It implements the spec and it's tested in exactly the same way that browser implementations are. Things that could almost never be gold standard, in fact, I don't think it's possible, would be, for instance, a CSS layout polyfill. They require just too much work from the browser. They usually cause layout shifts and things. If you try, and it's not an issue now, but for instance, when CSS Grid came out, people were like, well, could you write a polyfill? And it's like, well, in theory you could, but you wouldn't want it because it would just cause too much sort of shifting around and create a bad experience. So it actually turned out that there were so few polyfills that we could wholeheartedly recommend that everybody could use in all circumstances. We didn't go down that route. We instead decided it was more important to create clarity around baseline. Now, this doesn't mean that you can never use a polyfill, because you know the thing that a team working on this sort of separately from anyone's website just can't know. You know how you intend to use the feature. For example, there is a polyfill for container queries. Again, that's now widely available. You probably don't need to use it, but it does exist. And it's kind of fine to use that if you have one thing on your page and you've tested it all, but you wouldn't want to drop that in if you had 30 things on your page using container queries. Now, only you know that. You know how you're using these things. So when you're introducing a polyfill, that is definitely something you can do if you want to use a feature, but it's something that you kind of need to think about carefully in the context of your app and test it. So really good examples are actually things that already have a JavaScript library that does the thing. So for example, we've now got, it's implemented in Safari, grid lanes in CSS, which is masonry. It creates that masonry layout, the sort of Pinterest layout that people have wanted to do and kind of always thought they could do with grid and then realized it didn't quite work like that. So grid lanes is essentially that masonry. And the WebKit team have just produced a really nice site, gridlanes.webkit.org. I very much suggest you have a look at it. It's got loads of lovely examples and information about it. So that's something to look at. So that's only at the moment in Safari. And very, very simple, in CSS, creating that masonry layout. And that CSS gives you something a bit like this. Now, in a browser that doesn't support grid lanes, this will fall back to block layout. So essentially, all of those images would just display one below the other, because that's what browsers do. So an option here might be to fall back to a different layout type. For example, you could do the feature queries method that I mentioned before. You could use multicol, which gives you a masonry-looking sort of layout, or you could go back to a normal grid layout. The other thing you could do is you can load in one of the JavaScript libraries that does masonry. There's obviously masonry.js is a sort of the really popular one. So basically, this JavaScript is, again, from the WebKit team. I've put the URL there. So here we're loading in that library if the browser doesn't have support. Now, the thing is, the team at Microsoft are already working on the implementation for Chrome for grid lanes. So it's probably going to come to Chrome at some point soon, at which point then anyone in Chrome will use the CSS masonry rather than load in the JavaScript. So this is a kind of really nice way that you can sort of polyfill support for new features, especially where they have kind of taken inspiration from one of these JavaScript libraries, which is quite often how we choose to work on new CSS, is to look at things people are already doing and see, can we make a better way of doing it? So there's another set of considerations that you might want to make before choosing a feature. We've thought about how many people will not get the feature, but it's also worth considering how long it will be before they get the feature. As I mentioned, with grid lanes, we know that there's implementation being worked on for Chrome. So fallbacks and polyfills are kind of like, how do I use this feature and make it okay without the feature? But we also want to think about, well, for how long is that situation going to go on? So we've got different sort of sets of features here. We've got those that are already baseline newly available. So that's a feature that you want to use. It's already baseline newly available. And so you know that a good chunk of your users who have the latest browser, they've updated their browser, have already got that. So in this case, it's kind of worth figuring out like how far along the path to baseline it is. If you're doing a brand new project, you're just starting it today, well, most projects take a fair few months before they actually land. Which features are going to be baseline by that point? For example, you might have a great use for CSS registered custom properties with the app property rule. It's in baseline 2024, and it becomes baseline widely available next January. So if you're working on something today that isn't going to launch till after January, registered custom properties are going to be widely available at that point. And they're pretty cool because they let you set the allowed type, initial value, and inheritance on custom properties, which means that if the property, in this case, my color, is used with an incorrect type, so someone puts a number in there, The value gets thrown away because it's invalid, and the initial value is used instead. So it can make use of CSS custom properties much more robust. Now, you might be concerned to make all of your use of custom properties using something that felt a bit new, but there's other interesting things you can do with them. And so it's kind of worth thinking, well, also, how am I going to use this newer feature? Because I think the very neat thing about registered custom properties is they let you animate things that you previously couldn't. Gradients, for example, you couldn't transition those before. You can use registered custom properties to actually transition and do animations with gradients. Now, that use of custom properties is probably a bit easier to create a fallback for. You can just not have the animation in the gradient in that case. There's an example of that URL on web.dev that Una created. So I think this gives you this ability to actually look into the future of browser support. And it's something that I feel is a bit of an underrated feature of having baseline, because we've got all this data about features and their support and when they become newly available. You can start to look at what you're going to have in 6 months' time, in a year's time, and you can make your browser decisions accordingly rather than tying yourself to something that's from the past. Because as things approach the widely available line, more and more people are going to have that support. We've already seen people build some tools to help you make the decisions on a feature-by-feature basis. There's a tool, Run Vision, which gives you a very cool way to explore features, and that's a performance tool. Because one of the things that's really important with, some of the newer features are much more performant. So you get a good performance enhancement, say, by picking a newer feature over an old JavaScript method of doing it. So sometimes there's a real improvement for your site to actually start jumping on these newer features as soon as you know that the audience can support them. You can also look up some of these things. This is the Web Platform Features Explorer. So you can see here is Subgrid, which is now widely available, which I'm very happy about. If you know my history talking about grid layout, I'm very pleased to see Subgrid out there for everyone to use. So things that are newly available are probably a bit easier to consider. You know they're interoperable. They're in all the browsers. They're just getting more support as people update. But what about everything else? What about the things that we class limited availability? So they're available in some of the browsers, but not all. So I think single browser implementations are the trickiest. These are the other end of the spectrum. This is where only one browser has implemented the thing. Now, the obvious issue is that far fewer people are going to have that thing than something that's newly available because it's only in one browser. There's also this issue of stability. Both the IETF and W3C have wording around features advancing on their standards track that require at least 2 interoperable implementations of the feature. Now, this is really important because if only one browser has implemented a feature, we know we can implement it in that one browser. We don't know if another browser can actually do it. They may not be able to, or they might, when they start implementing it, go, hang on, there's a problem here that browser 1 didn't spot or didn't happen in browser 1 because the underlying browser code is different. Once you've got 2 browsers, once you've got, say, Chrome and Firefox or Safari and Firefox, because those engines are quite different, if 2 people, 2 engineers have managed to implement the thing into a browser and it works in the same way, it's probably pretty stable. We see this all the time in CSS. People do an experimental implementation. Someone else comes along, has a go, and then raises loads of issues against the spec because they find all the things that have gone wrong. So this is why MDN marks single-engine implementations as experimental, even if the feature is on a standards track. So even if it's in a standard spec, it's going through the W3C process, you want those 2 implementations to know that it is possible for that to be implemented. Again, might not be a showstopper. If the feature's compelling and useful enough, you've used it, you're keeping an eye out for potential deprecations or changes to the spec, you might be happy to go ahead. I think this is a place where knowing your team and how the project is going to be maintained is really important. I used to do just client work and build stuff for people. And if you're handing something over to a client and then you're walking away because you're done, that's what you were paid to do, that's a very different situation from having an in-house team looking after the thing, making updates. I think you want to be much more conservative in the situation where they don't have a team there to maintain it than if you're there maintaining it and you can keep an eye on things changing and make updates if you need to. And really, even within that realm of single browser features, there are some kind of subcategories. Because the feature might be in a nightly version of another browser. If it is, it means that we've got another implementation happening. So hopefully, a lot of those stability issues are already being worked out. This happens a lot with CSS. You see a lot of the CSS features recently have appeared very quickly in all three engines. And that's because everybody's been working together to get the thing out. They tend to be, you can probably bet on one of those features, a lot more safely than something that is only in one browser. Is it on a standards track? Is it being worked on within a working group? So something like the W3C, IETF. If it's in the CSS working group and it's actually in a spec, that's published, that means that multiple people are working on this from different browsers. So even if there's not two implementations, you hope there's been a lot of, discourse and people talking about it. Another signal would be if it's in interop. A lot of the features that have become newly available recently have been in the interop project. This involves all major browser vendors. The group selects a set of features and everyone works together to make them interoperable. This brought features such as the navigation API, URL pattern, view transitions, all those things to baseline. So this has been a real driver of new features coming through. If something's in that project, the important thing is it's got a stable spec, it's got a good test suite, and so it's at a point where you can probably rely on it. Things that might raise a red flag are features where one browser has an active standards position against the feature. Vendors ask their positions on new proposals. A positive response doesn't necessarily mean they're going to work on the thing, it just means they don't have any objections to it. If a browser vendor has a negative position, that browser probably isn't going to implement that feature unless things change, unless some new information comes to light. And then we have things that are missing in one browser. So things that have two implementations, so Chrome and Firefox, but not in Safari, or Firefox and Safari, but not in Chrome. Now, they're interesting because, as I say, we've got past that point of multiple implementations. We've got two implementations. They're probably on a path to baseline. And a lot of these are happening very quickly. There's contrast color, which landed in Chrome 147. It was in Firefox 146, and then Safari 26. So it was missing in one browser for about 4 months before it became baseline. But you do get features that sit in this status for a very long time. And so the amount of time for things to become newly available, then widely available, can really vary. We've been using the data we've got to shine a light on this to see how many features are missing in one browser. If you look on the stats page on webstatus.dev, you can see this. If you click on the line, you can see which features are missing in one browser for each of the browsers. And obviously that changes each month as new features ship. So some of these features, we've got the marker pseudo element. This lets you style list markers independently of their text. It's fully supported by Chrome and Firefox, but not Safari. But this is another feature where it's kind of worth having a look based on what you want to do, because actually this use case, just changing the color, is supported in all of the browsers. So you can do that. It's been supported for quite a long time. The thing that isn't fully supported and means that it isn't classed as baseline is doing something like this, using the content property to insert an emoji or anything else as a marker. This is really quite useful for design, but this part, using the content property, isn't supported by Safari. So that would give you something like this, which I think is an excellent way to style a list. There's subtleties sometimes. It's not always, this thing is totally not supported. Sometimes there's some part of it isn't working, or maybe some part of it causes an accessibility issue. And so we've deemed it can't be baseline because of this serious issue for some users. So there are some subtleties like that. Other things, we've got the temporal API, which is in Chrome and Firefox now, but not in Safari. It makes working with dates so much better, and would be really great, I think, once that becomes newly available. There's a really nice article about temporal on the Piccoli blog if you want to find out why it's so much better than date. And then we have scroll-driven animations. They let you do all your sort of scrolly-telling type effects, and also neat things. This little example, which is from a developer.chrome.com article by Bramus, which is a progress indicator to show how far through an article you are, which kind of looks like that. There's lots of examples there. It's not yet supported by Firefox. The good news, though, and this is again why you sort of, things can be moving along that line, the feature's behind a flag in Firefox. So it's part of Interop 2026. And so hopefully that's going to become newly available very soon, because there's lots of fun things you can do with scroll-driven animations. And to play with them, scroll-driven-animations.style, this is a site that Bramus has created. And there's loads of examples so you can see the sorts of things you can do with scroll-driven animations. So yeah, we look forward to that one becoming baseline. So should you use a feature that's missing in only one browser? I think, it's really the same decision as any other limited availability features. Consider your fallbacks and the likely time to baseline. I think they are very different in terms of stability from a single browser implementation, because we know that it kind of works in two browsers. You're far less likely to have the problem of it suddenly changing. I can't think of many features that have had to be had the spec updated when browser number 3 implemented. The big changes tend to be when browser number 2 comes along and points out problems. So I think, if you're handing a project over to a client and you had some things that were missing in one browser, you're probably fairly safe at that point, that as the new browser does the implementation, it's then just going to work everywhere. In particular, with these missing in one browser features, it's really helpful if you can come and express support for the feature to be implemented. We've got a thumbs up feature. It's part of the web status.dev data, and you can see that. You can then sort of upvote things that you would like to see. So please do that. These signals are really important to browsers and those of us who work on them. If I'm trying to encourage Chrome to implement something, the question I will be asked is, well, does anyone actually want this thing? So giving those signals to browsers is really, really helpful. And even more so if you have a good use case for the thing. If you are having to use JavaScript and it doesn't perform very well to do this thing, if you've got a really cool example of something that would be great to do if you had it, those use cases are super useful. Those are the questions that people who work at browsers are asked. Why do people need it? What are they having to do otherwise? Are they hitting up against accessibility or performance issues because of this other thing they're having to do because they don't have the feature? If we know that, it's much easier for us to go and make a case, because browsers are just businesses, and they have to have a business case for doing stuff. It's much easier for us to make that case if we've got the use cases and we can take them. From working on browsers, I know that actually you don't need many people to put their hand up with a compelling use case to actually get something over the line and be implemented. So I think that's something that you can all do, is don't just sit back and think, oh, it's a shame we don't have that on the web. Show us the use cases, because people who work, particularly in browser DevRel, this is kind of what we're looking for, to be able to take back to the people who make the decisions and who have the money. And I can't really get through this whole talk as a person who works for Google without mentioning AI. But I mean, through this talk, I've been encouraging a thoughtful approach to browser support, not simply ruling things out because they don't meet a baseline. And I'm sure many of you are experimenting with, if not using, LLM-based tools. Have a show of hands. Do you mind putting your hands up? Who's using LLM-based tools, agents, and things? Yeah, there's quite a lot of you. Yeah, I think lots of people are in different ways. We've been thinking about that because we know this is something that's happening, and we didn't want to provide all this clarity and then just sort of throw it all in the bin because everyone's using agents and not looking at the information anymore. So at I/O last month, we launched a preview of Modern Web Guidance. It's a set of skills that embed web platform expertise, best practices, and browser compatibility data directly into the coding agents. So if you're using, any coding agent, Claude, Copilot, Antigravity, whatever, take a look. There's a lot of experience and knowledge baked into this guidance, and it's being updated all the time. And when features aren't widely available, we're using Baseline to help us sort of figure that out. The guidance aims to get agents making good choices about polyfills and fallbacks. There does seem to be some pretty good sort of experience coming back from people who are trying this out, and they're getting a much better result than they were when not using modern web guidance, where what happens is the agents tend to use really old stuff, because obviously there's a lot of that out there on the web as examples. So, we really hope that this is going to help you build better websites if when you're using agents. So do check that out, and we'd love to hear any feedback. It is an early preview, and we're working on it. So if you hit any problems or you see anything you'd like to improve, do let the team know. So to wrap up, browser support's always going to have some element of it depends. But I do think that Baseline, and particularly the tooling ecosystem that is developing, can give you more clarity than we've had before. So when thinking about browser support, consider these things. Your audience. If you've got data for your audience, you can define your own baseline or check whether widely available works for you. Otherwise, widely available is a great starting point. Think about your team and how the site will be maintained. Are you part of a permanent team maintaining and developing the site? Do you have time to make changes later? Or are you handing this over to someone else to maintain? That may well dictate how conservative you need to be and how happy you are to sort of use limited availability features. Understand the feature's path to baseline. Is it just about to become newly available because there's a implementation behind a flag in the last browser? Knowing that makes you sort of feel safer to use things, or maybe decide not to. If the thing's not in baseline or it's just newly available, what's the fallback? Is it actually fine if people don't have that feature? And then what's the future? The data supporting Baseline gives you a better way to understand the future of browser compatibility. You're starting that site today. It's not going to launch for 6 months. You can probably start to include things that are a little bit more in the future. If you've used a single browser implementation, how are you keeping tabs on any changes? How are you watching to see if when somebody else comes along to implement and they make changes to the spec, are you watching to see if those changes are going to be made in the first browser? And also, use tools to support your decision. Whether that's coding agents or Chrome DevTools, Browsers List, ESLint, you've got tools there to help you stay on track. So should you feel happy to use those newer features? I think absolutely yes. The web is changing really quickly, and new things are landing in browsers all the time. And many of those are things that we've waited for ages for as web developers, and we should feel happy to start using them and get excited about them as they show up, rather than waiting for sort of it to become interoperable and then 30 months. Do use them. Take a holistic look at features outside of your baseline to make really good decisions about what to use and when, and enjoy what's becoming available to designers and developers. Thank you very much.